People say Ron's all Trump, but he is so much more.
Big league. So good.
Given that Ron DeSantis was elected on a platform of Trumpism and has consistently stood behind Trump on his worst policies, it should come as no surprise that he is one of the most popular figures in the Republican Party today. In a poll from the Conservative Political Action Conference back in February, 43% of responders said they would vote for DeSantis if Trump did not run in 2024. So DeSantis, presumably in a prelude to his bid for world domination, has signed a few new bills. Although they are ostensibly to increase civics literacy and do include some solid ideas, they are mainly to facilitate the stifling of ideas that DeSantis and the Republicans in the Florida legislature have decided that they do not like. Given the blatantly anti-left nature of the language the governor has used in describing this legislation, it appears to be nothing less than a Cold War-style propaganda campaign. House Bill 5 introduces new anti-left material to high school classrooms in Florida, and House Bill 233 seeks to create challenges on college campuses for professors who disagree with DeSantis. House Bill 5 mandates that high school government classes must include a comparative discussion of political ideologies, such as communism and totalitarianism, that conflict with the principles of freedom and democracy essential to the founding principles of the United States. The wording of this legislation is extremely startling. I thought we were past the anti-communist indoctrination bullshit. Just a few weeks ago, the Florida Board of Education voted to ban critical race theory from its curriculum. It cannot be a coincidence that this push from the Florida legislature to establish an even narrower capitalist orthodoxy in high schools comes right off of the heels of that. The Republican Party has become even more explicit in their message that to question modern late-stage capitalism is tantamount to opposition to freedom and democracy.
The bill also expands our previous efforts in civics to add a requirement for the high school government class that students receive instruction on the evils of communism and totalitarian ideologies.
It is frankly appalling that DeSantis would attempt to hide this kind of indoctrination in a push for civics literacy. He is clearly not opposed to using fascist politics. Teaching children about the evils of communism and its opposition to the founding principles of the United States simply does not leave room for a nuanced discussion. The Florida education system wants to produce students that believe Marxism is equivalent to totalitarianism and have no reason to question the status quo. But at least it proposes showing them a sample ballot, right? I think it's important to mention a core proponent of this legislation, the Victims of Communism Foundation. It was established in the 90s by a unanimous act of Congress, but chiefly supported by, among others, a senator who voted against the ADA and a representative who was charged in 1995 with improper use of campaign contributions. It's essentially a propaganda organization that's constantly pushing the idea that communism killed 400 billion people, so needless to say, I hate them. In between these bills is Senate Bill 1108. It's essentially a minor education reform that adds some new civics requirements, such as a new standardized test and showing students how to vote. Although it doesn't really contain anything sinister, the clip in which DeSantis provides justification for it is really something.
And these efforts are needed. A recent survey found that only 2 in 5 American adults can correctly name the 3 branches of government. More than a third of Americans cannot name any of the rights that are protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And in 2018, a poll found that only 36% of Americans could pass a multiple choice version of the citizenship test that our naturalized citizens have to take before becoming American citizens.
So it becomes painfully obvious why America needs to know about how many gajillion people Stalin killed with his bare hands. Perhaps this kind of indoctrination is what led to this state in the first place? Surely the golden age of America that fascists are constantly yearning to return to is not the one in which education standards weren't strict enough to ensure graduating students would remember how many branches of government there are. The next bill that DeSantis addresses is House Bill 233, which is in my opinion far more troubling. Following the old tradition of fascist anti-intellectualism, DeSantis and the legislature are attacking universities for not being capitalist enough. The legislation is requiring universities to run surveys that gauge how students feel about their intellectual freedom on campus, and the diversity of viewpoints that are presented to them. On face value, this appears to be positive, but the fascist subtext behind this push, and ones like it by conservatives all around the country, are clearly just to ensure that their expired ideology is propagated in places it simply does not belong. Here's a clip of DeSantis discussing the necessity of this legislation.
And I know a lot of parents, one of the things they worry about, if you send a kid to a university, are they just going to basically be indoctrinated? Are they actually going to be taught to think for themselves, challenge assumptions, and really be critical thinkers and learners? We obviously want our universities to be focused on critical thinking, academic rigor. We do not want them as basically hotbeds for stale ideology.
Stale ideology? Is any ideology staler than capitalism? Except, like, monarchism? The state usually does not do something like this if it doesn't have specific consequences in mind. DeSantis appears to be suggesting budget cuts if universities do not conform to his standards of academic rigor, but how are we to know that they are truly to stop there? DeSantis has not given us any reason to believe that he is motivated by a genuine desire for the diversity of ideas. He appears to just be upset that his political ideology isn't as popular anymore, and he wants to ensure that this isn't the case in the next generation. There's only one point here in which non-anecdotal justification is provided for this legislation.
Getting back to the bill, the governor mentioned in his opening remarks about some surveys he had looked at. When Senator Ray Rodriguez and I started to develop the language for this bill, we looked at a 2017 national survey of student engagement across college campuses across the United States. And what the survey found is that 71% of college students agreed that their institution placed a premium on diversity when that question was asked in terms of race, gender, or religious affiliation. But when that question was expanded to ask about political viewpoint, intellectual freedom, that number dropped from 71% to 50%, which told us that our institutions in large part are placing a premium on people that look different but think the same. And that's not diversity, that's conformity.
Perhaps it was my inability to properly do research, but I was unable to find the survey with those statistics. The National Survey for Student Engagement from 2017 didn't have the data he suggested, and none of the student engagement surveys I looked up backed up his 71% to 50% number, but if anybody knows where those numbers came from, I am open to it. This kind of behavior is entirely unsurprising in hindsight. The right's anti-intellectualism has been building up for a long time. The professor watch list, created by Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, wants to keep records of professors who they feel indoctrinate students. Although there are a few examples of professors on this site doing some pretty bad things, it's clear they simply want to attack professors they view as leftists. The legislation also stresses that opposing viewpoints must be included in class, but doesn't exactly expand upon what that actually means. One of the funnier journalistic takes here is that creationism will have to be taught alongside evolution, but there is no indication that this would actually be the case. It is far more likely that any mention of Marx would simply be followed by a list of state-approved reasons why America won the Cold War. The legislation also attempts to limit the university's ability to shield students from information. From the text of the bill, shield means to limit students, faculty members, or staff members' access to or observation of ideas and opinions that they may find uncomfortable, unwelcome, disagreeable, or offensive. I imagine this is a government mandate to let racists say the N-word at college. I'm sure the far-right nationalists would be proud. It appears that all this legislation seeks to accomplish is to establish a bunch of blanket terms and procedures for universities that will be instrumental in the right's deconstruction of the intellectual tradition. As they continue to fail to win elections, they will continue to attack education and the electoral system at large. Although I understood the way in which Donald Trump's politics were influenced by fascism, I didn't take the spread of fascist politics in the United States seriously until the attempted coup on January 6th. It is not enough to let the opposition to fascism be spearheaded by the corporatist Democrats. They do not actually fear the Republican flouting of democratic norms like they pretend to, and they do not have the workers' best interest at heart. I hope that in the future socialism will continue to be normalized in American politics, and this current reactionary push fails to indoctrinate the next generation. Thank you. Have a nice day.